It's Bill Harlow again. Thanks for joining us on the Cipher Briefs Cover Stories podcast. Jim Lawler was a highly decorated CIA officer who conducted some legendary clandestine operations for the agency. He now excels as a novelist and has just published his third work of fiction, The Traitor's Tale, a novel of treachery within the CIA. I'm looking forward to talking with him not only about his book, but also about his career and how his art sometimes imitates his life. Let's get underway. Jim Lawler, welcome to the Cover Stories podcast.
Thank you, Bill.
And congratulations on the publication of your third novel. This one's called The Traitor's Tale. And I've enjoyed all of your books, but I must say that this one, for me, tops all the others, not just because of all the twists and turns in it, but also the subtle hints in the book that it reveals about the guy who wrote it.
Well, I think it's my most personal novel, that's for sure. And I think I've improved over the first couple of novels. I think if you're paying attention to what you're doing, you try and improve as you're going along. But it is my most personal one. It's the first time I've written in the first person for a large portion of the book. And I think it made it easier to convey thoughts in that fashion. So thank you. I do think it's, I like my first two books, but I think this one, is probably an improvement. So.
Well, it's always challenging to interview novelists about their books, in part because they don't want to give away too much about the plot. And it's also easy to confuse listeners talking in great depth about characters that they don't yet know about. Mm-hmm. Or you get details that get too much in the weeds. But since this is your third novel and you're highly experienced now on doing the elevator pitch for books, take a shot at giving our listeners just a short synopsis, the Reader's Digest version of the arc of the story in the book.
I will tell you what inspired this book was we've had a couple of cases at the CIA that basically inspired the whole plot line. One was a tragic case of a CIA case officer named Brian Kelly, who was accused of being a Russian mole. And for at least a year or two, he was in purgatory, and a lot of people treated him as if he was infected, he was a leper, and because he was under suspicion of being a Russian mole. Well, it turned out that Brian was innocent, and that the real mole was Robert Hansen, an FBI agent. And the Bureau was a little arrogant in this, thinking that it had to be another penetration of the CIA, just like Aldrich Ames had been, and some other folks had been. And so they refused to look at the fact that maybe the dirty laundry was actually in their house. And so I wrote this thinking, what if you were a Brian Kelly and you'd been wrongly accused of espionage and you're exonerated, but you're so upset at the way people abandoned you that you think, to hell with them, I'm going to do it. And you volunteer to the Russians. So I wove that in with another case that's very famous. I can talk about it because there's been some cleared versions of this from our pre-publication clearance review board. Holy be thy name. Anyways, this case was the GT Prologue case, which is back in the late 80s when a very senior KGB officer volunteered to our chief of station, Jack Downing. And for the next 2 years, there was considerable debate as to whether GT Prologue was legitimate, a bona fide volunteer, or if he was a dangle and a double agent. The conventional wisdom at headquarters was that the KGB would never, ever run a staff officer, especially a senior staff officer, at us as a double agent for a number of reasons. But one was they thought that the so-called double agent might actually become a triple agent and want to work for us. And so there was considerable debate between headquarters and Moscow Station as to whether GT Prologue, that was his code name, was in fact legitimate, a bona fide volunteer, a real CIA asset in the KGB or not. And it turned out, ultimately, he was a dangle from the get-go. It was a brilliant operation devised by a very, very bright KGB, senior KGB officer who was in charge of counterintelligence, whose name was Rem Krasilnikov. Rem was a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist. In fact, REM, his name, his first name, his given name, that is the Russian acronym for World Revolution. And he was married to a woman named Ninel, which is Lenin spelled backwards. So we're talking about red aristocracy. And Krasilnikov, for all the reasons that I may despise him as being a KGB, senior KGB officer, he was brilliant. And so he had his deputy, Mr. GT Prologue. His real name was Alexander Sasha Zhomov. And he had Zhomov volunteer to us. And ultimately, he did this for several reasons. Number one, they were at that time in the late 80s still running Aldrich Ames, still running Robert Hansen. And so this was a diversion that if they could learn our methodologies and things, they could protect their assets in Washington. And at the same time, there was considerable friction between Moscow Station, where there were some officers who suspected that Zhomov, GT Prologue, was in fact a double agent all the time. And it became very rancorous. And ultimately, when they provided our best exfiltration plan to the KGB to get Zhomov to the United States, he, of course, did not show up because he was bad from the get-go. But we exposed our best exfiltration plan to the Russians, and then so many officers inside of Moscow Station were upset with headquarters, the way they had been distrusted when they insisted that he was a double, that they quit. So Krasilnikov ultimately fractured Moscow Station, caused a lot of very good CIA officers to resign. And so I thought, what if we had a twist on the Brian Kelly case and GT Prologue, and we had one of our officers actually volunteer to the Russians and try and see where we could take this. The ultimate goal of this was not simple double agents, but we knew, in my novel that is, the head of our counterintelligence knew that we were losing assets out of Russia House, which is in charge of Russian operations, and that there had to be a mole inside. A long time ago, a very senior KGB agent, he was Victor Cherkashin, Colonel Victor Cherkashin. He was the one who actually ran both Ames and Hansen. And Cherkashin said something that's very true, that in order to catch a spy, it takes a spy. In other words, you have to penetrate the other side and have that side tell you exactly what's going on or give you such good information that you will uncover who the penetration is in your service. So I wove these stories together, and I added in a little artificial intelligence. I added in quantum computing. And I won't go into why that's significant, but I'll tell you bluntly that whoever develops what they call cryptographically relevant quantum computing first is going to be not just miles, but light years ahead of the opposition, because that would mean that all of our best encryption schemes would be worthless. You might as well put it in plain text. So I wove that into the story, and having our man, his name that I gave him was Ambrose Knight III. Oh, and by the way, Ambrose is African American, so he's got a reason why he can tell the Russians he wants to cooperate with them. First, he was falsely accused of being a mole, and secondly, because of some inherent racism in the agency, and the Russians bite off on that. I won't go any further because I don't want to spoil it for you, but that's the tension. And Ambrose, poor guy, he discovers that with maybe 2 or 3 exceptions, most of his friends do desert him.
Well, it's an interesting tale that you tell, and lots of different twists and turns. And Ambrose is sort of a master recruiter himself, and that's something that I know that you were, and you demonstrate that ability because I believe you now have the Guinness Book World Records and the largest number of blurbs for your book. There's more well-known former intelligence officers endorsing your book than I've seen anywhere. So it demonstrates your skill as a recruiter. So well done there once again.
Well, Bill, I thank you for that. I can't run operations anymore, and I can't recruit people, so I live vicariously through my characters in my novels. And it does keep the neurons firing in this old gray head. So
Well, another interesting thing in reading your book is, for those of us that know you, is trying to figure out which parts of the story you're drawing from your own personal history and which parts you're inventing. I know, like Ambrose, like you, is from Texas and went to law school before joining the agency. You're not 6'5" and African American, so there are some differences. But how do you decide, which parts of your life to expose and make a character or a trait in your book, and which parts you just invent out of whole cloth?
great question. If something actually happened to me in my past and I could recount it, I mean, there's one thing where one of my other major character is a Native American, a Lakota female case officer named Shawnee Chasing Hawk, and Shawnee has an exercise at the training facility at the farm, and I go into great detail about that training facility. And quite simply, the training exercise was that you are in this hypothetical country. You are romancing some penetration of the country's foreign ministry with the aim of recruiting that person as a source. And so you've gone through 2 or 3 meetings trying to develop and assess the target that you want to recruit in this hypothetical country. And then what you don't know is that the instructor who is role-playing as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs person that you're trying to recruit, what you don't know is that he, in fact, is a member of that country's security service. And when you pitch that officer, when you pitch that guy, the instructor is going to whip out his plasticuffs, show you his creds, and arrest you because you have just committed espionage. Well, this actually happened when I was in training. When the instructor whipped out his plasticuffs and his creds and confronted me with the fact that he was really the security service and that I was under arrest, my response, as was Shawnee's in my novel, was, "This is wonderful. You're much more valuable to me now." And I went into what I call the metaphysics of actually a mental neural link with the target. And I watched the instructor as he was slowly putting away the plastic cuffs, slowly put away his creds. And he said, "Jim, I felt like a bird in front of a snake." And I was the only person out of 30 career trainees who was not arrested. In fact, I recruited my asset. And so I took that story and I had Shawnee Chasing Hawk do the same thing. There were some other scenes too. I think there was at least one polygraph scene that I was sitting in that chair going through a polygraph. I jokingly call a polygraph a colonoscopy of the soul because they're trying to get everything out. And the polygraphers, they're colleagues, so I don't want to diss them too much. But we've all been through polygraphs, and they are not pleasant. They are not pleasant. And there are ways that the polygrapher, the operator, talks to you the way he or she, in my book it's a she, tries to win you over, tries to maybe shock you a bit, confront you a bit, see how you react. And the best polygrapher is always a very skilled psychologist who's watching you, to watch you for those tells, to watch you for deception, to see if the story hangs together that you're saying this. And, I have a lot of respect for our polygraphers, but sitting through a polygraph is never, never, ever a pleasant experience. And so I've got a scene in the novel about that as well. And a couple of other things, too, that I draw upon. And by the way, the characters like Ambrose Knight, based on two very good friends of mine, Bill Phillips and Daryl Blocker, both absolutely first-class senior African-American case officers. Bill and I were at the farm together. We were in training exercises together. I met Daryl a few years ago after he had retired. He actually ran the farm for a while. He was head of Africa Division. But I based Ambrose Knight basically on those two gentlemen. I based Shawnee Chasing Hawk on my dear friend, former DIA case officer Shawnee Delaney. She's not Lakota, but she is an absolute top-class recruiter. I have taught, and I'm not exaggerating when I say I've taught thousands of CIA, FBI, DIA, Special Ops Command folks techniques on recruiting human targets. And of all those thousand, she's the best I've ever encountered. She's a natural. And she also believes in this neural link that I call the metaphysics of reaching into somebody's brain and basically getting them to do what you want them to do, to become a recruited asset.
Well, that's another one of the enjoyable things about your book. At the very end, you have a sort of a reader's note where you explain some of the sources and you identify some of the people who inspired the characters. And so that's really an interesting way. You don't have to guess too much about it. Once you make it through the book about sources of some of your stories and the tales that you tell and the people who inspired them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, two of the characters are in all three of my books, and that would be Scott Stewart, Brian Bannock. Scott was a top-class counterintelligence officer that I worked with. Scott was an unusual counterintelligence officer in that he would see not only what the weaknesses in a case were, but also the strengths of a case. And he would weigh them fairly. And, CI officers sometimes have a reputation of being very negative, taking pot shots at your operations, which is not that, they're supposed to look at it objectively. And Scott always did. So my character of Brian Bannock, the head of counterintelligence in my novel, is based on Scott. And then the deputy director of CIA is based on another friend of mine, Paula Doyle. She comes across as Paula Davenport in the novel. Paula and I worked twice together, and she was on my AQ-Con nuclear weapons takedown team. And she would go to hell and back to, do the right thing. So I admire her integrity, her operational acumen, and so I had to base a character after her. Now, you might say, well, why do you base this on people? Well, it makes it easier. It's like a portrait artist who has a model, has somebody sitting there for a sitting, and you paint them. It's much more difficult to come up with a character out of sheer cloth, out of imagination. So I hope that I've conveyed truly these two officers and other people in my book. The villains, sometimes I've based a villain on somebody I know as well, but I'm not going to tell you who those are.
They're not named in the back of the book.
No, they're not.
It's a kind of a disappointment, but we'll just have to guess who they might be.
It's funny. I actually had a very dear friend of mine, Suzanne Matthews, Jason Matthews' widow, who guessed one of the characters in Living Lies, and she wrote to me and she said, "Is it this person?" I said, "Don't repeat that."
Okay, we'll have to interview her now to find out who that might be. But the main characters in your book are good recruiters, and as you say, recruiters manipulate, exploit others to get them to do things for them. And you talked about your neural link theory, but what are the requirements, or what are the capabilities of somebody who's a good recruiter? What do they bring to the game that makes them successful when others might not be?
I made a list of 10 qualities that a top-class recruiter has. The first one is being a good listener. You don't recruit people when you're talking. You recruit people when you're listening. Secondly, being naturally curious. I've always been a very curious person about people, about what makes them tick. And I think that's, I would do this regardless of whether I'd been a case officer or not. If I hadn't been a case officer, I think I would have loved to have been a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And then I think the next thing is persistence. In one case, it took me 10 years to recruit a target. He was unrecruitable for the first 9.5 years. And then things fell apart in his life. And I was there for him. And that took me 30 seconds to break cover and recruit this guy. So persistence, being able to read stress patterns in people. You don't recruit, or I never recruited a happy person. You don't recruit happy people. You recruit people who are unhappy and under stress. And I had an ability over time to see what the stress patterns were. I used to be a rock climber, and the way you climb a mountain, is you look for crack patterns. places where you can put your fingers and your toes and go up the rock. You can't climb smooth rock. You just got to be crack system. And people are like that. I would study persons just like I study the rock. What's the crack system here? And maybe I can bring some kind of resolution to this. I can bring comfort to this person. I can offer them something that they need. And everybody at some point needs something. Given enough stress, my theory is everybody's recruitable under enough stress. Then there's other qualities of a good recruiter. Things like never ever being afraid of pitching someone for fear that they would, number one, be insulted, or number two, that you're going to fail. And I taught my students that if you've never had a pitch turned down, you haven't pitched enough people. So in that respect, there's kind of a ruthlessness to it. I mean, you're taking this person out, you're developing this friendship, this relationship of trust, which is the fundamental basis of any human relationship, is trust. And especially with our targets who are coming from harsh environments where either their career or their very lives can be at stake. I mean, you think about our Russian or Chinese assets or Iranian assets. Those people, if they're discovered spying, they can be shot, hanged, tortured, whatever. And so you have to be a serious person, and you have to always put their security first. And I think the CIA is extremely good at that. We will go to hell and back to rescue our assets. If once we've made a commitment to them, we will absolutely go and do whatever's necessary to try and get them out of prison or get them out of trouble, and their families as well. We are very, very humane about that. We always put that at the top. We've made a commitment on behalf of the director, on behalf of the president sometimes, and we honor those commitments. We don't take that lightly. And a lot of intelligence services discard their assets. Just that's the way it goes. Well, no, it's not the way it goes with us. We are always going after and ensuring that we try and get our assets out of trouble if we can. Then other things, just besides the persistence. I mean, one of my big failures one time, I was chasing an Eastern European intelligence officer, and it was near the end of my tour in a certain country. And this guy, he was on the verge. He was really on the verge of saying yes, but he never said no. But he was on the verge. But then I was so busy ending my tour in this country with everything else going on that I did not go back time and time again and ask him, come on, you've got to make up your mind. Look at the way things are going in Eastern Europe. I can be your life ring. And I didn't do that. So that was, you learn more. In fact, I have a talk I give sometimes called My Favorite Failures, because you learn more from failure than you do from success oftentimes. And that was certainly a failure. My good friend Mike Rochford, senior FBI special agent, he had focused his entire career on Russians, and he was the one who recruited the Russian KGB officer who gave us Robert Hansen. And it took him 10 days, over a 10-day period. The Russian first said he was going to go to the New York Times because this was such a provocation. It was outrageous. And Mike kept at him for day after day after day. And finally, on about day 10, the Russian looked at him, and Mike had offered him a certain sum of money. The Russian looked at him and he said, Mr. Rochford, if I were to do this, it would have to be for more than what you're offering. And he named a figure, and Rochford said, deal. and that was without FBI headquarters or CIA headquarters approval, but he said deal. And so they shook on it, and then Mike Rochford asked this guy, the Russian, so who is it? Who are we looking for? And the guy said, well, I don't know. He never gave us his name. And he said, well, okay. But he said, I can find out. And so that's when he went into KGB headquarters. He got the file. He brought it out, gave it to a Moscow station officer. It was brought back to FBI headquarters. and they played it in the director's office. And one of the senior FBI agents was in there, and they heard a voice tape of when Hansen had called into the Russian embassy, a recording, and the FBI agent said, "God damn it, it's Bob Hansen." And then they found his fingerprints on some dead drop material. But had it not been for Mike Rochford being persistent, we would never have uncovered Robert Hansen's treachery.
At one point in the book, you write that the CIA had long studied a possible common thread among the recruited assets. And one of the things that in the book you say is that they often have dysfunctional relationships with their fathers and mothers. I think Hansen had a dysfunctional relationship with his father, for example. But
Right.
is that true? Is that a common thread among people who are willing to?
I think it is. We limited the study to some of our Russian assets, and that was a common thread. But also, if you look at, like you just said, Robert Hansen had a dysfunctional relationship. Even when I studied Kim Philby, now Philby supposedly was, he was one of the Cambridge Five. He was recruited in the 30s. When he was at Cambridge, he was a Marxist, supposedly. But that was, if you recall, back in the 30s, it was very fashionable for college students to be Marxists. And I think that was certainly what he paid lip service to, was the Marxism, the attraction to Marxism. But I found out that his father, St. John Philby, was a British, very famous British guy. He was always traveling. He was an Arabist. I think he converted to Islam and married an Arab woman. He was constantly gone. And so Kim Philby never had a real relationship with his father. And I mentioned that to good psychiatrist friends of mine, Dr. Ken DeClava and Dr. David Charney, and they both said, I think there's something to that. It wasn't just the Marxism. That sounds good. In fact, it always sounds good if you're a spy to say there's some ideological reason why I'm doing this. That sounds very noble. But in fact, there's typically many more layers as to motivations as to why people do this. It's rarely a single motivation. I know the first substantial person I ever recruited, I had pitched him, he turned me down, and then a week later, he asked me if the offer was still good, and I said yes. And it turned out that his wife wanted a divorce, and that he couldn't afford to pay her alimony, plus put his kids through private schools when they went back to their country, unless he accepted my offer with the financial stipend that I had promised. But then I found out at the first meeting, the follow-up meeting, there's a lot more to it than just a financial need for his alimony and for his kids' education. He handed me a stack of maybe 3 or 4 inches thick of classified documents. And he said, "Jim, let me tell you why I'm doing this." He said, "I hate my boss, the ambassador." He said he takes credit for everything I do and everything everybody else in the embassy does. And as I hand you this classified material, it's as if I'm kicking that son of a bitch in the face. And so revenge, and you ask yourself, why would somebody betray a trust? Why would they commit treason? If they're betrayed first, they're only evening a score. And so I would offer people the chance to come over to my team and be on my team. That team doesn't treat you right, come to my team. And I think that's a big motivation, is revenge. But you're right, Bill. Dysfunctional relationships. And if you noticed in my novel, there are several people with dysfunctional, as I call them, papa or daddy issues. There are several of them that have that and that are motivators for that. I think it's probably more likely to be a father than a mother, although there could be a mother that's also a dysfunctional relationship with.
Well, it's worthy of further study and further novels. Speaking of novels, when you read other people's novels written by people who are not intelligence professionals, what do they most often get wrong? What is it that annoys you when you read somebody else's spy novel?
Well, those who are not intelligence officers, some of my intelligence officer friends like Ilana Berry and David McCloskey, they get it, they nail it. Jason Matthews, of course, they nail it. But I'd say the ones who are not intelligence officers, they put a lot more what I call the Jason Bourne, the type of guns and all the shoot 'em ups and things. And my novels have a certain degree of that, yeah, but in fact, most of the time, the most intense elements are the human factors. So therefore, John le Carré, I mean, he was wonderful. Just his was all about the human factor. In fact, one of his novels was called The Human Factor, as I recall. But Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, why people betray their country. I that to me that and of course John le Carré, David Cornwell was his true name. He had been first MI5 and then MI6 British intelligence, and so he had served abroad as a case officer, so he knew exactly what he was writing about. There are some folks who are not intelligence officers who managed to write some pretty decent books. Paul Vittich is one. Some others, that I can't think of at the moment, but who write a fairly decent espionage. Actually, I have a number of them call me and ask me, "Is this real? What has happened?" And so I give them, the fact that either that's plausible or it's not. And you always have to realize there's a difference between reality and entertainment. And
Right.
so, there's one scene in my novel where I won't tell you about it, but it was a little pretty unrealistic, but it was entertainment and it moved the novel along. So sometimes you have to suspend total reality. And the one thing you really have to suspend is the time thing. I mean, CIA operations do not proceed like, at light speed. They frequently go on for months and sometimes years before they come to a culmination. And then they take off like a skyrocket. But it's rare for it to be constantly, moving about and things like that. I give this talk sometimes in colleges about what it's like to be a CIA officer. And I remember giving it at a high school about 2 years ago. And one of my good friends is a former FBI employee, Tim Gill, who teaches history. And so he had me come over and give a talk at one of the local high schools here in Arlington. And I'm talking all about the human side of things. And these guys, there was about half men, half women in this class. I was mobbed by about 10 young women afterwards because it was all about the touchy-feely things, the human part of it. And nowhere did I mention about an Aston Martin or my weapons or anything like that. And the guys were all tuned out. You're thinking, well, this is boring. This is.
So, are you working on a fourth novel? And if so, can you reveal anything about the plot?
Yes, I am. This one is going to be a jointly written novel, which I've always been reluctant to consider because I thought if I write this with a friend, it's a good way to end a friendship. And I just thought, no, I'm not, But then I over the last couple of years, I've met a woman out on the West Coast her name is Johanna McCloy, and Johanna is the daughter of a real CIA NOC. He's passed away now, but she was the daughter of a NOC. And when we had the recent spate of Russian illegals who were repatriated back to Russia, and some of their children didn't even speak Russian. They were, it was a kind of a traumatic thing to find out. Number one, you're not Brazilian or Portuguese. And by the way, your native language should be Russian. And so I had Johanna on Jeff Stein's Spy Talk program to talk about what it's like to be the daughter of a NOC. And so she wrote and asked, is there anything else we could do together? And I've always had this plot in mind of a novel which I was going to call Loose Threads. And any case officer, given enough time, probably has some operations that never came to fruition. They didn't come together for some reason or another, maybe a reason you can't explain, but they're just out there as loose threads. So this novel of mine assumes that there's a retired NOC officer, maybe about my age, and his daughter, he's got one child. His daughter has only in the last few years discovered that he was a CIA deep cover officer. And he's been bothered by the fact that he had these loose threads in his past. And he's bored. Here he had been a very well-respected CIA non-official cover officer, a lot of excitement. He was a top-class recruiter, and he's bored out of his mind. and he's drinking too much. His wife died a year earlier, an apparent suicide. He's depressed. He's almost suicidal. And then the loose threads start to come together again. The operations that he had been involved in, they start to touch his life again. And he becomes injured while pursuing these things just on his own. He's just got to see what was going on. He becomes injured and is kind of like Jimmy Stewart in Rear Window. He's in his bed. He can't get out. And his daughter has to take up the baton and run with it. And we find out in the novel that his handler, a knock handler, the knocks always have somebody who is a handler, an officially covered officer who meets with them out of country somewhere and conveys their thoughts and everything to headquarters. I was a knock handler at times. Well, it turns out that his knock handler, in fact, was the reason these loose threads never came together, because the knock handler is a mole. And it's also the reason why his wife died. In fact, she wasn't a suicide. She found out that the handler was a mole. And so we've got this converging thing of being betrayed. Not only did his handler betray him, but, basically romanced his wife, killed his wife when she discovered who he really was. And then the daughter is having to take up all this. So that fourth novel will be called The Spy's Daughter.
Well, we look forward to seeing that one as well. Let me wrap up here with one last question for you. I mentioned that there's a lot that those of us who have known you for a while can read between the lines in your book and figure out what you're alluding to. One mystery, though, that you didn't resolve in the book, at the agency, your nickname is Mad Dog. And there is one reference to Mad Dog in there, but I've never found out why your nickname is Mad Dog, because you seem like anything but. So for our final question, could you reveal the source of your nickname?
Yes, I can. I've been a runner for the last 50 years, long-distance runner. And one morning in Paris, I was running in the Bois de Boulogne, the big park, and I passed a German shepherd who never growled or barked or anything, but I got about 8 or 9 yards past him when suddenly I felt the most searing pain in my right leg, and he had my calf in his jaws, and I managed to pull my leg out of his jaws. I tried to run, but you can't outrun a dog, and so I picked up a branch on the ground and I hit him over the head with it, and then I took off running and bleeding all the way home. When I got to the embassy, they said that dog was acting very strange. He didn't bark, growl, or anything. He just attacked you. There's a good chance that dog is rabid. So I had to go off to the Pasteur Institute in Paris. That's where they developed the rabies vaccine. And I went over there, and I was dreading what we used to call 21 shots in the belly. And I mentioned that to the French physician, and he said, "No, sir, no, monsieur, no, we don't do that anymore. You're going to get a shot in each arm, and then you're going to come back in a week. We'll get a shot in the right arm, and then come back a week after that, a shot in the left arm. But if you don't take the shot, there's only been one person in history that we know of that's ever survived rabies. You will go progressively mad and die a horrible death." So I got the shots, and then I went back to my office in the station. And at the time, I was having a little bit of tension with some of the people at headquarters. I guess that comes with the territory. So I made a list of all the people I was going to bite if I developed rabies. And so that's what gave rise to my nickname.
Fortunately, it didn't come to that.
No, it didn't.
And the rest is history. And thank goodness for that, because we have The Traitor's Tale to read. So thank you again for joining us. We appreciate it, and we highly encourage our listeners to check out The Traitor's Tale.